Charles Kupchan is a Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University and a Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He joins us now live from Chevy Chase. Thank you so much for being with us. So Donald Trump has said that he hopes to speak with Vladimir Putin this week. What do you expect will come from that conversation, and will Putin get on board with this 30-day ceasefire?
I think there's a reasonable chance that the Russians will say yes, maybe 50-50, partly because I think Putin doesn't want to be seen as the person who scuttles the deal. He doesn't want to be seen in the eyes of the world as the party that says, no, we want to keep fighting. Two, I think Putin really would like to carve out a good working relationship with Trump. That relationship is in some ways his ticket to come in from the cold, to end 3 years of harsh diplomatic and economic isolation from the West. And third, this is a war that has not been a lot of fun for the Russians. They have lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, many more hundreds of thousands wounded. It's a very expensive war. The sanctions are starting to bite. So I think there is a reasonable chance that Putin will at least say yes to the 30-day proposal and then see if they can't make progress toward a more lasting peace deal.
And so Trump has brandished the threat of harsh sanctions. In your view, it may not even get to that with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I think that the easy part is going to be the ceasefire and the territory. And that's because wherever the troops are when a ceasefire is reached, that line becomes a new line of contact, a new border, if you will. And under the best of circumstances, that would become a buffer zone. You'd see troops and heavy weapons pull back from both sides. But then the hard work really begins, because the Russians are going to say, we want Ukraine to be neutral. And the Ukrainians are going to say, no, thank you. The Russians are going to say, we want limits on Ukraine's armed forces. And the Ukrainians are going to say, no, we need to prepare to defend ourselves because you could come at us again. The Russians may say, we want the end of sanctions. Trump may say, well, let's see how things go. So when that conversation begins, I think the conversation will get more difficult. And my best guess is that even if we get a ceasefire, we're more likely to see a frozen conflict than a real peace deal.
And Charles, I note that the joint statement from the US-Ukraine meeting did not mention the explicit security guarantees that Zelensky was so vehemently seeking. The Americans have mentioned that they were discussed, but nothing in that joint statement. Will they come?
No. I think Zelensky wants NATO membership, and he has said that quite explicitly. He is not going to get it, and that's because there's no consensus in the alliance, and Trump isn't interested in guaranteeing Ukrainian security. I do think, however, that if this is a deal that's going to last, you're going to need a commitment from the US and Europe to keep the arms flowing to Ukraine so it has what it needs to defend itself. And ideally, you would get in that buffer zone an international force that includes some Europeans to monitor the peace, but also to make it clear to the Russians that if they do keep coming, they're going to end up running into an international force and not just Ukrainians. That is a pretty good deterrent.
And you mentioned the Europeans there. What will they be looking for as this deal develops? And this has been seen as a huge wake-up call for Europe, having relied on the support from the States for so long and now talking about rearming, boosting defence spending. What is Europe's role going forward going to be, do you think?
Well, I think right now there's a sigh of relief across Europe, and that's mainly because Trump has agreed to turn back on the flow of military aid and the flow of intelligence to Ukraine. I think the Europeans were well aware that if Trump pulls the rug out from underneath Zelensky, Ukraine may not survive. Europe probably would not be able to fill that gap. We're now back in a situation in which the US and Europe are working together to backstop Ukraine. The second thing I think the Europeans are going to be looking for is a seat at the table, consultation. And I'm hoping that over the course of this week, There'll be a lot of discussions between Washington and Brussels, Washington and European capitals, because if this deal does stick, it needs to rest on a consensus forged between the US, Ukraine, and US allies in Europe.
Charles Kupchan, Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University and a Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Good to be with you.